right. Good afternoon. It is May 21st, Thursday, May 21st, 2020. This is your weekly installment of the Economic Justice Law Review weekly scholarship presentation, or our weekly scholarship review. Again, at the Economic Justice Law Review, we do not publish original scholarship. We gather with a repository for race, economics, and law scholarship that's produced all around the country in publishing houses, law reviews, and journals, and bringing it to you all. I guess you could almost say back in the day, that was like Reader's Digest or Negro Digest, which preceded Ebony and Jet. So, in that vein, I am your host, Andre Smith. You got 15 years at AALS institutions, Penn State, Florida International University, Widener University, I guess it's the Delaware Law School at this point, and also Howard University School of Law, which is also my alma mater, right? So, for those that know, I'm a tax guy, but economic justice is my larger rubric, and with respect to that, it is my position and the way in which we collate and categorize all the scholarship that we bring here at the Economic Justice Law Review is through a concept or a framework called racially asymmetric market imperfections. And we're going to talk about a lot of that today because the books that we have really identify that market structure as the problem. So what do I mean by racially asymmetric market failures? If we start with the idea that there is supposed to be a free market, and again, we're talking about Gary Becker, we're talking about free market fundamentalism, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, blah, blah, blah. What we're saying about a free market is not any market. It has certain assumptions. So a free market that is supposed to produce, justly distribute goods and services requires 4 assumptions before we can call it a free market. Number 1, everyone is a profit maximizer. 2, everyone can enter or leave any lucrative or non-lucrative market they choose. 3, everyone has perfect information about everything. 4, there are no transaction costs or negative like taxes or negative externalities like pollution. So if that's the case, if that mythical world, a market can distribute goods and services based on who needs them the most, or who wants or desires them the most, we can use the utility function. However, in real life, we know that you're not going to sell your child at any price, much less a particular one. So everyone is not a profit maximizer. There are altruistic feelings out there. Everyone cannot leave or enter any market they choose. So when we talk about capital gaps, we're talking about racially asymmetric market competition. And that's just financial capital. We can also talk about human capital, political capital, and social capital gaps in terms of those racially asymmetric market competition. Then there's also the fact that information is obviously imperfect for everybody. However, it's racially asymmetrically imperfect when it comes to the information about black people, and that we're talking about media stereotyping, Eurocentric education, and then also asymmetric with respect to the information available to black people. And here we're talking about public education and the U.S. v. Richardson and its retrenchment of Brown versus Board. We won't go deep into that. And then, of course, there are taxes, there are negative externalities, there are tort and criminal law assigned costs to untoward behavior. And we find that when it comes to environmental racism, racialized healthcare, criminal justice system, and even the tax system being regressive and racist, again, those transaction costs and externalities of society are asymmetrically distributed with respect to race, right? So racially asymmetric market imperfection, racially asymmetric competition, racially asymmetric market information, racially asymmetric transaction costs and negative externalities, and then withdraw a racially asymmetric commitment to market participation. All of those 4 constructs or those 4 elements represent as a whole racially asymmetric market failure, or the economic component of structural racism, right? It describes our subordination right now At the same time, it shows how it will be perpetuated in the future by DeMarquette. I call it DeMarquette as if the market is a god, right? DeMarquette knows everything. All right, so that's the framework we're working with. So what are our feature presentations? We got 3 dynamite books this week. Every week we've done leading up to this, I think just about every week leading up to this, we've talked about articles published in law reviews and journals across the country. Today, we have 3 books that have come out within the last month, or at least one is going to come out, but at least announced. 3 books that have been identified over the last month that have a serious hook to race economics and the law. And so we're going to present those today. Number 1, William Darity, Sandy Darity, one of the preeminent black economists in the country today, out of Duke, and Kirsten Mullen, who is an independent scholar, are talking about reparations. And as we talk about reparations, we're talking about combating racially asymmetric market competition, the racial wealth gap. It's William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans, and that's published out of the University of North Carolina Press 2020. The second book that we're going to talk about is by Gene Sperling, who is also independent. He has been on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's been a very high up as far as government in the Obama administration. I believe he's with the Biden administration along with Derek Hamilton as policy advisors. And he's going to talk about wealth and income inequality from a general nature, but and what's important about it is he identifies or he recognizes free market failure in a general sense. So his prescription, those of Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, Gabriel Zuckman, Thomas Piketty, right? They attack, or at the very least, they disagree with, if not attack, the free market fundamentalism, right? The claim that there is a free market without recognizing the imperfections in it that will reproduce wealth inequality in a general sense, and also racially asymmetric market imperfection. So that's going to lead us to the third book, and this is super fire. This is super fire. Isabel Wilkerson, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from 1994, the author of The Warmth of Other Suns that came out about 10 years ago. Isabel Wilkerson is putting out a new book called Caste, right? We're talking about occupational caste as racially asymmetric free market failure. So we just talked about Gene Sperling talking about free market failure. Caste, we're going to talk about asymmetrical free market failure. More formally, it's called it's Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, and it is published by Random House in 2020. Or I want to say it's going to come out in October, so you can pre-order Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. And so we're going to talk later, or we're going to talk about all 3 of these books more specifically in just a second. I'm going to remind you of some great pieces that we talked about in the previous weeks. Just so if you're tuning in today, let me make sure you are aware of some of the very great articles that are out there that will support your scholarship, help you with your classes. Last week we talked about Teri Dobbins-Baxter had Dying for Equal Protection, the history of racial health disparities in the United States, published in Hastings Law Journal. You can find, again, someone outside of law school, David McBride, a tenured old school professor from Penn State that has written, he wrote TB to AIDS. He's talked about racialized healthcare from the very beginning, and is talking about from Hurricane Katrina, just a very broad scholar. So Teri Dobbins-Baxter, Dying for Equal Protection, is a welcome addition to Dana Matthews Bowen, Michelle Goodwin, even Dorothy Roberts, right, at Penn, all those that deal with racialized healthcare. We also talked about Jill Weber Lenz, Children, Wrongful Death, and Punitive Damages in the Boston University Law Review, her attempt to try to persuade the law to switch the damage assessment for wrongful death in children from a pecuniary examination, an economic examination, talking about future earnings, to a punitive death scenario where we talk about the pain and the grief of the parent, right? Why? Because of the well, in part because of the racially discriminatory nature of pecuniary damages for children's death when it comes to race and also gender. Gerardo Span, old school veteran critical rights theorist at Georgetown, had published Gerrymandering Justiciability in the Georgetown Law Journal 2020, basically criticizing the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on race-based gerrymandering, which is justiciable, versus political gerrymandering, which is not justiciable, and the way it's worded or the way it's constructed, as he says, the court can basically choose. It can excuse racial gerrymandering by calling it political gerrymandering, and then if you're trying to fix racial gerrymandering, then they will scuttle it. So he shows how the justiciability of gerrymandering has been inverted from its so-called purposes. Okay, we've done in previous weeks Prince and Schwartz, Proxy Discrimination in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. That's consistent with Ruha Benjamin's The New Jim Code, Race After Technology, a great book by a Princeton author. This is Prince and Schwartz, published in the Iowa Law Review. Jason Bent has we did a paper on his that's very related to that. Is Algorithmic Affirmative Action Legal? Woo, that's a fire paper right there. Noah Zatz, Get to Work or Go to Jail. Megan Berry and Richard Weiner, Ex-Offender Housing, Stigma and Discrimination. Paul Malika's The Unfinished Mission of Title VII. William Sable, Trends in Correctional Control. Bernadette Tuaheni, Predatory Cities. Beth Colgan, Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. There's so much. Every week we want to just drink it all in. I can't give it to you all every week, but know that every week we're going to put out a review and 3 pieces, or likely 3 pieces of scholarship that reflect on race economics and justice, race economics and the law for you justice scholars out there. So let's talk a little more specifically about the ones we're featuring this week. First, we're talking about Sandy Darity, William Darity. Folks call him Sandy Darity. William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans. William Darity, again, is one of the premier black economists. Reparations and the racial wealth gap is a huge part of his scholarship. One of the great papers he's ever written, he co-authored a piece with Derek Hamilton that was published by the St. Louis Fed, and it is such a beautiful assault and successful assault on the myth of black inferiority. He shows that when we talk about what black people don't do, and the pathology when it comes to owning homes or investing or employment or starting businesses, he shows that black people with the same wealth as white people do the same things. However, black people with the same income as white folks do not, right? It is the accumulated wealth that should determine the similarly situated, when the media uses income, which is discriminatory in itself, right? Black folks with the same income, because of intergenerational wealth transfers, have far less wealth in the bank, even if we're making the same amount. So he goes further. He's a big reparations proponent. In this one, let me read you from the paper. From the description of the book. At several historic moments, the trajectory of racial inequality could have been altered dramatically. Perhaps no moment was more opportune than the early days of Reconstruction, when the U.S. government temporarily implemented a major redistribution of land for former slaveholders to the newly emancipated enslaved. In other words, 40 acres and a mule. But neither Reconstruction nor the New Deal nor the Civil Rights struggle led to an economically just and fair nation. Today, systematic inequality persists in the form of housing discrimination, unequal education, police brutality, mass incarceration, employment discrimination, and massive wealth and opportunity gaps. Economic data indicates that for every dollar the average white household holds, not makes, but holds, the average black household possesses a mere 10 cents. right? So that's 10 times. Using innovative methods that link monetary values to historical wrongs, they next assess the literal and figurative costs of justice denied in the 155 years since the end of the Civil War. Finally, Darity and Mullen offer a detailed roadmap for an effective reparations program, including a substantial payment to each documented U.S. black descendant of slavery. Taken individually, any one of the three areas of justice outlined by Darity and Mullen, slavery, Jim Crow, and modern-day discrimination, makes a powerful case for black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. Wonderful, wonderfully written from the book. Now, as a critical scholar, I not only criticize white supremacy, I'm critical of just about everything. So when it says taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore, yeah, policymakers are going to ignore them. The case for reparations is just. It is solid. It is repeated over and over again. I have written on reparations. Myself and Carlton Waterhouse did reparations and taxation. How would a reparations scheme be taxed? And I need to read this book to talk about how his plan would or would not be taxed by the Internal Revenue Code. However, when I wrote that article or co-wrote that article with Professor Waterhouse, I made very clear that interest convergence theory, which I believe is a very solid intellectual construct, very predictive, descriptive of the past and predictive of the future, as a theory ought to be, militates very strongly against white folks giving us reparations, especially when you identify the fact that they're not stopping they're not going to stop discriminating against. The education is unequal. There is police brutality. Mass incarceration is being fueled. Employment discrimination. These things, while they have a structural component, there is some agency, right? There is some agency. Right? There are neoconservatives and those others that are putting fuel to the fire. So they recognize the case and work against it. Meanwhile, interest convergence says that even those white folks that are neutral, that aren't into exacerbating the racial wealth gap, do not have an interest in closing it, at least the elite whites. And we see that in what was the last case? The Byron Allen case, Comcast versus NAAOM. So the numbers are important. We need to understand the depth of our economic subordination. This also harkens unto Frank Wilderson's Afro-pessimism, because again the question becomes, and let me switch sides real quick, because I want to see like I'm bashing reparations as if it's totally impossible or if the case is unjust. As a matter of fact, I even suggest that in my book, Taxes and Racial Economic Justice, we're not making enough use of slavery as a 100% tax on black labor, as Jim Crow sharecropping tantamount to slavery as a 100% tax on black labor. I also show that the federal tariff of the 19th century transported probably at least a half, if not more, of the profits from slavery from the South to the North. Right? We can talk more specifically about how that happened later. But the case for reparations is absolutely positively strong. However, justice, this is a democracy, not a theocracy. It is not run by justice. It is run by power. It is run by interest, those who vote and whatnot. So in convincing others to provide reparations for us, I know that the Japanese got reparations. I know that victims of the Holocaust got reparations because they have global capital, right? They have global capital to push those decisions. At this point, again, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but we do not. I will also argue that, well, let me just read my description and critique of it from our framework. I don't want to depart too much from our framework. Reparations are intended to help close the racial wealth gap, right? When I talk about the framework, the racially asymmetric market failures. Reparations are intended to help close the racial capital gap, which represents racially asymmetric market competition. However, the racial wealth gap was caused and will reassert itself via other failures and imperfections if they go unaddressed. If we get all this money, if we get this substantial payment, but yet there is still racially asymmetric market engagement, racially asymmetric information available to and available about black folks, if the transaction costs, the negative externalities from environmental pollution to police brutality to tax system, if all those transaction costs are distributed asymmetrically, then it will only be a matter of time before the racial wealth gap asserts itself. And that's even if black folks get right mentally, if that's the problem, if we are in fact pathological, which I don't agree with. But even if we did the exact same things as white folks, the structure of the market would reproduce the racial wealth gap. Maybe more slowly this time around, but again, those structures have to be addressed if a so-called free market is going to redistribute goods and services justly. So long as those imperfections are there, then the opposite will happen. The free market will distribute them unjustly. The racial employment and housing discrimination, as he describes, represents racially asymmetric market competition in terms of both financial and human capital. Unequal education reflects racially asymmetric market information available to black people. Police brutality represents racially asymmetric transaction costs and negative externalities. The sum total of these racial wealth and opportunity gaps exacerbates racially asymmetric profit maximization in terms of greater withdrawal from a system rigged against black people. And again, that's the economic description of Afro-pessimism, basically. So if reparations were distributed, asymmetrical market failures left unaddressed will reproduce that economic subordination in the future. So I am for reparations. I will write in support of reparations. I think it's very important for us to understand that the racial wealth gap and how it places us here, and that it is responsible for our inferiority and not our own pathology. However, that does not necessarily mean that racial reparations are coming. It does mean that it is owed. It means that it is due. It does not necessarily mean that it's coming. And so if it is not, self-determination will have to come from insular sources. Or as Albert Einstein said, closer union of the minority so the soul of the minority can be attained. All right, so if we're not getting reparations, what is the plan? What is the so-called quote-unquote black agenda or economic justice agenda? Well, here comes the second book. And again, this is from a general prescription. Gene Sperling mentions race in his book. However, it is not about racism per se. He's talking about wealth inequality and income inequality from a general sense. So this is his book, Economic Dignity, right? So something from the book. Too often, Gene Sperling found that our economic debate confused ends and means. When they talk about he worked for the Obama administration. He's worked for the Council of Foreign Relations. I think he was even within the Clinton White House, the Bill Clinton White House. So he's a long-time political veteran. Too often, Gene Sperling found that our economic debate confused ends and means. Right? And I agree. Racial asymmetric market perfections is about means, not the ends. That we measured economic success by metrics like GDP instead of whether the economy was succeeding in lifting up the sense of meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and security of people. Right? I mean, you don't get money just for money's sake. The money is you're supposed to do something with it. And he wants to look through money to those things such as meaning, purpose, fulfillment, and security of people. Why? Because if we can provide those things to people without the money, then inequality wouldn't be so bad. Again, it's only pieces of paper. There's a lot of ways to look at the racial wealth gap. Anyway, too often he found debates framed by old divisions on pro-market ideology that increasingly failed to capture whether economic policy was fostering exploitation, economic insecurity, and disillusionment that were too often invisible within our current framework. Now more than ever, at a moment when the very capacity of modern capitalism to avoid accelerating inequality, a hollowed-out middle class, and structural poverty is being questioned, we need to step back and reflect on our ultimate goals. Economic dignity is Sperling's effort to do just that. to frame our thinking about the way forward in a time of wrenching economic change. His argument combines moral and intellectual seriousness with actual high-level policy experience. Economic dignity, Sperling maintains, can be seen as resting on three pillars. Let's figure it out. The first, the capacity to care for family without economic deprivation, denying people the capacity to experience its greatest joys, the birth of one's children, the companionship of a loving partner, the love of family and friends, the fulfillment that comes from providing, right? The second, the right to the pursuit of potential and purpose, including the right to first and second chances, the right to a life of active striving. The third, economic participation with respect and without domination and humiliation. All three pillars are rooted in the highest and most noble values of the American project. Okay. So that's a great description of his book, Economic Dignity. Again, he is an advisor to Joe Biden, so we can assume that if Biden wins, Gene Sperling and also Derek Hamilton will be in the White House. He is for greater I can't describe the whole book, but I know the programs that he is definitely in favor of include universal basic income. So he's a proponent of universal basic income. Derek Hamilton is into a federal job guarantee. I did not see that as something within Sperling's framework, a universal job guarantee, a federal job guarantee. Now, he does seem to be in favor of universal basic income, which again is basically welfare for everybody and not just for needy children. Right, so reinvigorating welfare to go beyond mothers with children or parents with children to each individual within the state. Greater labor market protections. I assume more robust antitrust. He has also talked about buffering Social Security. Right, so definitely a few different ways in which. So again, let me give you my description of his work within the framework of racially asymmetric market failure or racially asymmetric market imperfections. A progressive political economist, Sperling's concern for a well-regulated free market is consistent with my concern for racially asymmetric market failure. We both are basically saying that there is no free market and that it is the duty of government to help create one. Right? When we talk about capitalism, are we even really in capitalism? If we talk about neoliberalism, if we talk about free marketing as the source of our discontents, do those things even exist if we look at actual free market ideology? Sperling's focus on human capital, right? Very, very poignant here. Sperling's focus on human capital via financial capital, via greater, more lucrative employment opportunities in Social Security and universal basic income, but his plan does not address asymmetries in market information about and available to Black people. So again, it addresses one of the very fundamental market imperfections that holds Black people back, right? The capital gaps with respect to market competition. However, again, there's three other, using his word, pillars of a free market, and one of them is asymmetric information, racially asymmetric information. And I don't see, it does not seem to address the school to prison pipeline or issues such as that. Media stereotyping on the other. Again, he's working from a general sense, but as Black folks, we know that the market will remain skewed against us if you fix one pillar and leave the other three unaddressed. Sperling addresses asymmetrically distributed transaction costs in terms of racist criminal law enforcement. He doesn't ignore race entirely, so kudos to him, but perhaps not so much in terms of environmental racism, racialized healthcare, and so forth, all of which reproduce economic racism. All of economic subordination, the racial wealth gap. Without addressing every aspect of racism, a free market, quote unquote, simply does not exist, neither the claim to meritocracy or the land of opportunity. Moreover, does the exclusive focus, this is important, does the exclusive focus on Black employment right? Because we're talking about employment and engaging in the marketplace and how we can work. But Democrats and progressives seem to ignore and sometimes lambast the black folks who seek to be in the capital class. And not just the Magic Johnsons and Oprah Winfrey's. We're talking about black barbershops. We're talking about black restaurants, right? If we're only going to focus on robust black employment, does that exclusive focus reproduce caste, as we're going to now discuss with Isabel Wilkerson, right? All right, so Isabel Wilkerson, the Pulitzer, first woman to black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize back in 1994. She wrote *The Warmth of Other Suns*, that describes the migration from 1910 into the late 20th century of black folks from the Deep South to points north, including Chicago and elsewhere. Very illuminating, enlightening book, and she's back now to talk about how those people, how black people that migrated from an agricultural caste, migrated into urban cities in the north and all around the country, and still find themselves in the service caste. Again, we can anybody who's going to any restaurant, hardly in the country, you know what we're talking about. That the maitre d' and the host or the manager is usually going to be male, and most of the time it's going to be white. Could be female, but again, the numbers show it'll be disproportionately white male. The servers, right? The hostesses or the waitresses, waiters and waitresses, predominantly women, predominantly white, if there's a choice, right? And then when we get to the kitchen staff, then we're going to start to see people of color, right? Especially black and Latino. When we get to the busboys, the janitorial services, and what have you. Again, so this caste may be looser than is contemplated by India or Egypt or even antebellum slavery, although even there, caste was escapable in a certain sense, in that if you were the greatest seamstress or the greatest doctor and you were African, you would be rented out. So you could do work other than agricultural, but you would still not be in a higher social caste, because your money and your wealth were taken from you, and you would resort with the rest of us back on the plantation. Maybe those in the house, maybe not. Right? I guess the field versus the house Negro is intra-caste. Mm-hmm. All right, so let me read from the description of the book. The Pulitzer Prize-winning best-selling author of *The Warmth of Other Suns* examines the unspoken caste system that has shaped America and shows how our lives today are still defined by a hierarchy of human divisions. As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality, it is about power. Which groups have it and which do not. I could not agree more. In this brilliant book, Isabel Wilkerson gives us a masterful portrait of an unseen phenomenon in America as she explores through an immersive, deeply researched narrative and stories about real people how America today and throughout its history has been shaped by a hidden caste system, a rigid hierarchy of human rankings. Again, colorism, right, is just a hierarchy or caste based on distance from African heritage, right, all around the world. So we can talk about it in the United States context, or we can talk about global white supremacy and the assignment of position based on your distance from your African heritage, chosen or otherwise. One of the interesting things is in the book, she talks about the historical instances of caste, and she mentions the antebellum Confederacy. She talks about Nazi Germany, and she also assigns its origin to India, right, where the Aryan nation or the Aryans came down into India, conquered Indians, and then instituted a color caste system that reflected or has been the North Star for white supremacy for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. However, I am an Afrocentric thinker. I am a Pan-Africanist. So I have to problematize her work by arguing, as Herodotus does, that occupational caste started in Egypt before it migrated to India, Sumer, Babylonia, and outside. That if Egypt, as us Afrocentrics believe, have priority when it comes to the creation of the hallmarks of civilization, if Herodotus is correct, if he's the father of history, as Afrocentrics say, instead of the father of lies, as Eurocentrics say, then the caste system of employment going from father to son or family, that within the family, and then from there, again, African feudal taxation. Check out Henry Claassen. Check out Michael Tomowski, The Origins and Structures of Pre-Colonial African Institutions. African feudal taxation is ubiquitous on the continent, and it is essentially a caste system that the ruling ethnic group governs a land mass, each province being assigned or attached to another ethnic group, and the requirement that each province produce a certain amount of goods and give it to the crown. Not so the crown can enjoy it, but so the crown can then take your amount and then redistribute it to the other provinces. Feudal taxation or caste was the way in which pre-colonial African societies created a diverse economy. You do cotton, you do corn, you do wheat, you do metallurgy, you do whatever, some other type of craft. As taxes, we will take a portion of it for the state and then redistribute that portion to the other provinces that produce something different, right? So that way, this province may have created one item, and yet within that province is all of the items from the other provinces. So the power of the state, the power of the king, was in redistributing the wealth from one province to the next. Now, it was a redistribution, but the idea was for equality, because what you gave, you would also get. Right. So this also, when we go talk about Cemetery L, that preceded the Egyptian first dynasty, and the land that connected Nubia and Egypt, and the fact that in 430 to 4000 BC, it holds goods from Persia, from the Levant, would not, again, suggest that if African feudal taxation, if the caste system was in effect even prior to Egypt, then that supports African hierarchy throughout the Eurasian and Northeast African region for a very, very, very long period before the tables turn. Light becomes day, day becomes light, north becomes south, south becomes north, and we have the imposition of a racial caste system with black people on the bottom once the Aryan nation, Scythian, Greek, Syrian, etc. peoples begin to conquer and then subjugate Africa and put what's at the top down at the bottom. All right, that was very long-winded. Let me say specifically about Isabel Wilkerson's caste. I went to my own thing, which you can read about in Tax Law and Racial Economic Justice. I talk about all that stuff there. Because a free market, but let's do this in the terms of the framework for EJLR, right? Racially asymmetric market imperfections. Because a free market is defined in part by the ability of everyone to choose whichever market serves them and leave whichever market does not, a racial caste system reflects racially asymmetric market competition. To the extent caste is based on stereotypical information, it reflects and reinforces racially asymmetric market information about black people. To the extent the educational system supports the caste system, it will reflect racially asymmetric market information available to black people. In other words, you're only going to get taught to what we think you ought to know versus whatever you want to know. And COVID-19 illustrates vividly how a racial caste system asymmetrically distributes society's transaction costs and negative externalities onto black people. Black people are disproportionately the essential workers. We are disproportionately on the public transportation systems. We are disproportionately in the jails and prisons. We are disproportionately unable to avoid, our houses are smaller, we have more people in them. We are disproportionately able to avoid the coronavirus, and it all goes back to economics. It all goes back to the racial wealth gap, and that will be perpetuated even if we get reparations, so long as there are racially asymmetric market failures. So on the one hand, we absolutely must lobby to fix those imperfections. On the other hand, even whether those imperfections are there or are not, we have to personally, or I'm sorry, as a group, be even more attentive to capital accumulation to compete with others. And so a way in which to address all four of these market imperfections from an insular perspective, we ought to better educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, stop unduly criticizing each other. That is the revolution that will not be televised, right? That is the way to accumulate human, social, political, and financial capital, and as ways to close the gap when it comes to asymmetrical information, when it comes to closing the gap, when it comes to competition, when it comes to closing the gap as far as engaging with the marketplace. Now, when we talk about negative externalities and transaction costs, we have to have the financial wherewithal in a system that's governed by Citizens United, and a system that is absolutely perfectly tethered money to politics. We're not going to address those transaction costs and negative externalities without the power to do so, as Isabel Wilkerson said. And that's going to come from the capital, not just financial capital, human, social, political, and financial capital. That's all energy. That's all capacity. So, three fantastic books on race, economics, and the law. Sandy Darity and A. Kirsten Mullen's From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans from the University of North Carolina Press, number 1. Number 2, Gene Sperling's Economic Dignity, published by Random House. And then later this year, number 3, a powerhouse of a book, Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, published by Random House later in 2020. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to be back again next week and every week at the Economic Justice Law Review, revealing the repository for scholarship on race, economics, and law, categorizing them in terms of racially asymmetric market failure. See you guys next week. Dre Smith signing off.